Let me say it's a pleasure to be here and to talk about actually my research. We're gonna share with you a number of things. As Paul was saying, I got here in 1974. We're going to talk about the Austin model, and those of us who do the research, especially those associated with the Institute. We like to brag on Austin, so we'll brag on Austin a little bit. And then we'll look at how that has been maintained. And then we'll look at wealth creation and job creation. And most importantly, look at some of the research that my colleagues and I are doing on what we call the Austin model. Now, we call it the Austin model because, well, it is a model. And academicians like to think about models. So we have models that predict the weather. We have models that predict the tornadoes. And so when we get together as academicians, we like to ask a number of things. What we've done here, can we measure it? Can it be predictive? And more importantly, can it help in the future? Talking about Austin to me is pretty interesting. I'm a Louisiana boy myself, and growing up in southern Louisiana. And I was sitting at Northwestern University listening to the nighttime talk show, and the Hyatt Hotel founder was on there, Mr. Hyatt. And the person in was Johnny Carson. It was cold outside at Northwestern. And Johnny Carson asked Mr. Hyatt, Mr. Hyatt, this is the late night show. What would you like to say to the Americans? Anything that's profound that you would like to say? And he stood up and said, well, let me tell you this. When you take a shower, make sure that you put the curtain inside of the bathtub. Now, the reason for that, if you own hundreds of thousands of bathtubs, you would know that the model for the Hyatt is to stay clean, to be presentable. So our job here today is to look at our city of Austin, Texas, brag on it a little bit, look at the future, but more importantly, look at what we call the tremendous amount of wealth that has been created here. So me getting here in 1974, I called Lee Cook, former mayor. I said, Lee, let's meet for lunch and yap a little bit about Austin. Lee is an Alabama guy, so we met down at the Headliners Club, and I said, Lee, before you became mayor, what did you know about Austin? He said, well, John, I know that it took us about 100 years to get to 100,000 people. In the 30s and 40s, there was a guy by the name of Walter Long at the chamber, and the mayor was a guy named Miller. We didn't think much about economic development. I said, well, Mayor, what really got us going, if you can remember? He said, well, there was a Volkswagen dealer by the name of C.B. Smith, and he said, I need to sell some more cars. We need to do something different. So John Gray, another business person, went to the University of Texas to our Bureau of Business Research, hired some top-notch professors from northern schools, and came up with the idea. And they recommended that IBM land in Austin, and that would happen in 1962. Texas Instruments came. And the reason why those are significant is that it was pre of what we call the Austin model, but it was moving toward the idea of wealth creation and job creation and what we would call research and development and R&D. Research and development and R&D means that wealth can be created not just by the oil boom, and I sort of come from an oil family in southern Louisiana, so I like that stuff, but can also be developed with the relationship between what is going on in the laboratories, if you will, and how nations are changing. Our nation's changing. And this is how the nation was changing. Our idea and our visionary is a guy by the name of George Kosmeski. Case closed. George was dean here, founder of Teledyne. Came to Austin, landed here as dean, and said, you know, we need to do something different. He's a dean who had created Teledyne, who understood wealth creation and job creation. And what that meant for us was the following. We had to rethink, number one, what was happening in America. We had to rethink what was going on in different regions in America. We had to look at the changing competition of America. And the fact of the situation is, if we didn't change, we would be left behind. And what did George see that we did not see? But it was not just George. We had another person by the name of Governor Connolly of the Kennedy assassination fame. And he had come down and said the following, look, boys and girls, if you don't create a great research university, or remember the importance of research and development, all the money is going to the Northeast, Northwestern University, and Stanford. We will be left out of the equation for research and development. Another guy by the name of Pete O'Donnell, who said, you know, I'll help along by raising chairs so we can compete on the professorship side. But most importantly, our major competitor for a new way of doing things was Boston, or what we call in the literature 128 in Boston, and Silicon Valley that had done everything. Now, if we think about this kind of competition, what's changing? Well, we know that the entrepreneurial spirit has always been around in Texas, but the question is, how do you change the economy? And let me get academic a little while and talk about academic ideas and the economy and what was happening. So when I was a kid growing up in southern Louisiana, our Silicon Valley was Detroit. And now we know that that city is filing bankruptcy. And the model, if you will, for America and for the greatest jobs that had ever been created in the Western world was in Detroit, was in Cleveland, Ohio, Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And the prosperity was great, and the model went like this. We have a great company, General Motors, U.S. Steel, to create great opportunities. We'll create a lot of income. We have unions, and the unions will make sure that the income is distributed equally, or to an extent that the unions approve. Our model changed. Our model went from an emphasis on unions to shared prosperity. Now, what does that mean? That means that if you get academic about this stuff, you've got to think about an economy that is constantly changing. You've got to think about regions that are constantly changing. You cannot say that General Motors would be there forever and very prosperous. You cannot say that Apple Computer would be there forever and prosperous. The only thing that we know is because of research and the increasing nature of technology, that opportunities will change. So shared prosperity meant creating a situation where when you create a company, the members and the workers of the company are brought along. So if you go to Silicon Valley and you look at Hewlett-Packard and all of the startups which we'll talk about that were developing, Hewlett-Packard would say, I will give you a salary of $50,000. And Apple would say, I'll give you $20,000 with something called stock options, which we really knew nothing about. So the whole idea was to create an economy of shared prosperity, but most importantly, based on the R&D. Now, if you look at Austin, Texas, as Lee Cook would remind me, we always did two things, right? We always sort of recruited companies, and we always grew them. But what the university would bring to the table, and it would be Kosmeski and the university and IC Square, it would be the idea of the importance of startups and the idea of wealth creation. And another thing came along with that. The question became, if you're going to do this with TradeCore, which was a company that was spun out of the university, our first billionaire company, Motorola would come in the 1970s. AMD would come in the 1970s. I had a meeting with Glenn West and I were on a program yesterday morning, and we were bragging so much about Austin. We were talking about MCC and the changing image of the country and the changing image of Austin, Texas. But if you're going to do all of that, the question becomes, how do you change? What do you concentrate on? Well, the emphasis switched to R&D and making the entrepreneurs in what we call creating the Technopolis and the Austin model. Okay? Now, I want you to understand then that you're going from a situation where not only are you talking about changing the economy, but you're talking about putting entrepreneurship and self-employment at the very, very center of everything. Now remember, I mean, when I graduated from undergraduate school, my father said, okay, you're going to graduate school, you're going to get a PhD, and my grandfather said, well, boy, you got a BA, you got a MA, you got a PhD, what about a JOB? So what happened was, if you're going to change this model, you need to begin to think about what we would call the ecosystem. And how do you literally recruit entrepreneurs to be both the wealth creators and the providers of new jobs, to take the R&D and commercialize the R&D, and to literally create new companies. And the idea that Kosmeski had was pretty interesting. We're going to create what he would call a Technopolis, a city based on science and research. And the universities would be involved in the technology transfer. But technology and research was also being done at NASA. It was being done at laboratories, at military, Army, Navy. And so the question becomes, how can you take R&D and put that at the very, very center of everything? And more importantly, say, look, the universities are involved. Well, there was a great model out there already, which was the agriculture model. So I view the Austin model as standing on top of the agriculture model, and because the agriculture model at the turn of the century, that also was done in Texas, said the following. We're going to create A&M universities, like that other little university over there in College Station, which has evolved into a great university. And these A&M schools, we have something called demonstration agents. We're going to call them county agents. We're going to take all of the knowledge and know-how of the laboratory and transfer that to the farmer. And through that model, America fed the entire world. That meant if a farmer, and I might add that my father was all of his degrees were in agriculture, he was a county agent. So if everybody called and say, hey, come on, Savard, Professor Butler, as they call him, I have a little problem with the crawfish, yeah. That's the way I talk when I go home, by the way. And my father would say, well, what's the problem? You would go dip up the water, take it to the LSU experimental station, and do the research, and come back and say, this is what's wrong. It was fed by the 4-H club system. It was all over America. But the most important thing was it took technologies from the universities and enhanced the economic system. MIT, one of the first. Tuskegee in agriculture, one of the first. Stanford would come later, and then we would have what we would call the Austin model. So what is the Austin model? The Austin model is putting innovation and entrepreneurship at the very, very center of the economy to make sure that you have an emphasis on job creation and wealth creation. The wealth creation is important. And let me say something about that. I learned in my economics classes that profit was profit by a firm. Now I understand, as Schumpeter would say, that profit is a cost. It is a cost of competing in the future. It is the cost of surviving what we academicians would call creative destruction. Because what we know is that coming out of college, most of the Fortune 500 firms are not there. So with the advances in technology, the only thing that we are certain of is that the typewriter will be replaced by the computer. The automobile that you drive might be replaced with a handless automobile. If you look at all of the technological change that has taken place, from the Pony Express to the telegraph, those companies that understood that profit was a cost and not the accountant's profit would survive. So if you look and think about a company like our Dell computers, for Dell to survive and compete in the future, we know that he must have profit. So to do this, we got our, I got some of my friends up here. I must admit they're all friends that were involved in the model, because the model brings together government, industry, and academia. Now we're going to brag a little bit. For those of you who have heard it before, we like to brag, but we have so many people who have not heard it before. But what did it mean? Well, government and business used to fight each other. So Kosmeski got here at a time when everything was changing and people came together and said, let's create the Austin model. So I have Carol Thompson, who was the glue to bring everything together. I have Laura Kilcrease, who was the first director of the Austin Technology Incubator, which we'll talk about. I don't know who this person is, but I think that's Lee Cook. I think that's Kurt. I don't know who that Mary is, but I know all of them. And that governor over there represents the governor, George W. Bush, one of my golfing buddies and one of my best friends. So the point is, the question is, what did they do? How did they move Austin through the different kinds of situations? And this is what happened. I asked Lee Cook, I said, Lee Cook, tell me about Kosmeski. He said, well, I was on my way to a big meeting, and George called me and said, meet me in the parking lot. I said, well, I'm busy. So he said, well, I stopped by. George runs out and said, look, I'm going to do this Austin Technology Incubator. I'm going to put in $150,000. I want you to get $100,000 from the city. We're going to get $150,000, whatever the numbers were, from the county, and that was it. Okay? So the idea, as Laura Kilcrease used to like to call it, version 1.0, version 2.0, and et cetera, is go through the idea, and let me tell you what they all do. The first one was to create the Technopolis, and that is competing with Silicon Valley. Now, of course, we can write books about that, but you must realize, when I got here, we were losing all of our best and brightest to those three regions, to Silicon Valley and 128 in Boston. Because remember, the competition has changed. Competition is now about wealth creation, research and development, and from that research and development, literally creating wealth. That's what has changed. So consequently, the competition changes. Okay? What we do, and at the center of all of this, would always be building new companies. So even right now, people come to us and say, how do you build new companies? Okay? So the point is learning how to do that. Learning how to do that. George said, okay, we need to do another institute, because Reuben McDaniel, my good friend, at the business school, said, well, you can't really do that in the business school because we're very managerial. So he created the IC Square Institute that brought professors from all over campus, from the liberal arts, from the sciences, the business school, from the music school, to say, if you have a technology, how can you commercialize it? The next version was the diversification and the globalization. Okay? And that is, what are the lessons learned? Because now everybody is saying, if we want to be like Silicon Valley, we want to be like Austin. Version 3 is to scale the region, the scope, and the impact, and to move. Okay? So all of a sudden, everything is changing, and the wealth creation was phenomenal. Okay? So we call it now Silicon Hills, and we know we can't go through all the companies, but I can tell you about K. Hammer and Evolutionary Technologies. Tell you about Carl Paul and Golfsmith, Jim Tressard and National Instrument that came through RC Square, the hippie John Mackey, who did a great job with Whole Foods, Gary Hoover and Bookstop, Alan Blake and Glowfish, which is dear to me because I was the first investor, Carol Thompson and the Thompson Group, Jamie Rose and the Angel Networks, Joe and Austin Ventures. We've done all of that. And I asked Greg Pogue of the Institute, brag on a little bit for me, Bragg. Tell me where we are now after all of these years. And the question is, what would it look like if we would put it into a certain kind of schema? What does it mean? Now I'm going to talk about the university here. Okay? This Austin model, essentially, if you look at the university in that point, and let me add, we like to call it the Austin model. Other universities have been involved and are involved. But the idea is very, very interesting. What you want to do is take discovery, right, and see the university as a platform for wealth creation and for job creation. I don't have to tell you that when Dale went public, he created 935 millionaires in Austin. That's 30 million in the bank. I don't have to tell you that when Micah Dale did a foundation, it was important to us. I don't have to tell you about what Jim Tressard did. I don't have to tell you what my golfing buddies do, Thundercloud, and how they have enriched the community. I don't have to tell you about Amy's Ice Cream. And in my slides, I had San Antonio and Herb Kelleher, who's been very, very good. But that's an interesting story. I need to stop and say that. You know, when we were trying to get one of these consortiums here, MCC here, Cisneros was mayor of San Antonio. He was in Washington. He was talking about how great Texas was. He said, well, you know, in San Antonio, we have Rice University. And somebody said, Mayor, you know, Rice is in Houston. He said, oh, no, but we're moving that way. So consequently, we like to talk about these things. Now, some of the technologies might come from other places, but the important thing is this. Over a span of 35 years, the entire economy was changed. Over a span of 40 years, the city is a little different. Certainly, we have certain kinds of problems that we'll talk about. For example, I call my colleagues in Silicon Valley, and I would say, well, we're having an issue here with affordable housing. They said, yeah, we had that 10 years ago. I said, what's your issue now? Well, our issue now is that there are not enough airports to park all of the private planes. So with prosperity come different kinds of things. So here, if you go back and look at what we're doing, we've got, back it up a little bit here. We've got Bob Peterson at RC Square. We've got Robert Metcalf in engineering. We've got Rob Adams, Gary Catonhead, and McCombs. In addition to, we got 9, 10, 15 other incubators in Austin, Texas. So we know what we've done. The question is, what does the future look like? And how do we tap in to this wealth creation model? So let's talk some about my research and the movement of entrepreneurs. So what we have decided here is, if you look at what we've done in this Technopolis, the basic question is, how can we get more entrepreneurs to move to Austin? Now, remember that under the model, right, it changes from a traditional kind of economy to an economy where entrepreneurship is at the very, very center of the economy. Okay? It changes to a situation where we must understand what's happening with startups. So I was talking to a representative from the chamber yesterday, and she said, well, you know, she's working with Bob Metcalf on actually counting the number of startups because they come from nowhere. Not only do they come from nowhere, but they are creating so much wealth. In my undergraduate class last year, I had 2 startups, and one team sold their companies, that's Hat Tea, for millions of dollars. They're 19 years old. When I was 19, I was trying to beat Alabama. Now, the question is, how do you look at this? Well, the biggest change from the professor's point of view or my point of view is this big data stuff, okay? And the big data stuff will allow us to do a number of things. I want to create a model, okay? And what has happened is, I call it social physics, because the idea is that the breadcrumbs that we leave with our cell phones, when you go through a toll road, when you get on an airplane, when you use your GPS, I can almost model the movement of human beings as well as the physicists, did I say that? Can model the movement of the planets. So our everyday lives, we want to do that, and we want to change that so that we can exactly understand where we are, so we can look at kind of the future of Austin. Now, I'm just going to say what it is. I don't know if we should put these slides. Are we charging tuition? Gail, are we charging tuition? We got any Aggies in here? If you're Aggie, close your eyes. If not, I'm just going to talk about this. Rajiv, are you here? Rajiv is here. My co-author is here, and this is my PhD student from sociology here. And David Gibson, are you here? So I want you to visualize with me what we're trying to do. We're trying to create a situation. I need a Butler law. You know, Metcalf has a law. You know, he has a law, the Metcalf law. I need a Butler law. But I want my law to be around the movement of entrepreneurs. Can you envision, or can you imagine having a formula that would allow you to predict the prosperity of regions based on the movement of entrepreneurs? Now remember what the Mahler said. The Mahler said is that there is a relationship between prosperity, economic development, with innovation and entrepreneurship and wealth creation at the very, very center of everything. When we talk about the development of wealth creation, boards of directors investing in startups, you'll just be surprised. You won't be surprised at the amount of wealth that has been created. So what we said was, you know, we need a law. And, you know, I'm a statistician, and I think in statistical models. Rajiv, he thinks in functional models. So we had a program here in the AT Center on the whole idea of what can we learn from the analytics that's happening with all of these companies. So we had LinkedIn here, we had all of the social media here, and we came up with the idea that, look, we're going to take what we know in Austin and try to create a model. And basically, we're going to ask some fundamental questions. What's forcing people to come to Austin? I mean, how can individuals perceive what Austin is? Can we really begin to think about the idea that we can predict the movement of entrepreneurs? We're not worried so much about the movement of workers because they're going to follow. We're talking about the movement of entrepreneurs, okay? So the model then is very, very interesting. Can we have the next one there? The model is, don't think about this. Just say that an individual is kind of forced to come to Austin because of all the things that we have in place, okay? The social networks, the location, and et cetera. That's all we're saying, okay? And you can pay your tuition bill on the way out, right? In other words, what we're saying is that if you begin to model where we are, okay, one more, and if we begin to look at the idea of the Technopolis Wheel, What's forcing individuals to come here? The Technopolis Wheel is based on the combination and networking everybody together. Okay? This is how we created the Technopolis framework. So the pictures that we had people from government, we had people from industry. We knew that big companies would come here and bring smart people, and the big deal would be the ecosystem. I did a talk in Chicago, and people said, what do you mean the ecosystem? And I just asked a basic question. I said, when you want to be a country and western singer, where do you go? If you want to be a movie star, where do you go? If you want to be an opera singer, if you want to start a company. Why? Because the ecosystem is already set up. What the Austin model does is to put the wealth in place, it puts the accountants in place, the financial advisors in place, the business enablers in place, the R&D in place. So Stanford created Silicon Valley. MIT created 128 in Boston. And UT Austin, in conjunction with lots of others, created what we call the Austin model, or what I call the Austin miracle. Because I can tell you this, in 1974 and 1976, when I first heard it, I was not convinced. I don't think anybody was convinced. So our question is, very interesting one. Look, we are competing now with all of these regions. They all have certain kinds of things that's going on. We kind of established the fact that the university itself is important. Governor Connolly said, hey, if you're not in that business, it's going to be very, very difficult. And by the way, we did it at a state school. We didn't do it at a private school like Stanford, but we did it at the University of Texas at Austin. So I said, Rajiv, if we can begin to think about how this would be conceptualized, well, let's take a look at Hooke's law. And we're going to say that we know about Hooke's law, about the force needed to extend a spring, and the distance is proportional to that distance. Well, let's talk about human beings, okay? How can we separate them from Silicon Valley? How can we literally separate them from Baton Rouge, Louisiana? How can we separate them from New York City and say, if you want to be a country western singer, you go to the ecosystem? So we kind of worked that out. And as we work that out, it kind of looks like this. And this is just all the Technopolis stuff. Don't worry about that. I just said in plain English. Hey, we're going to draw you to Austin. We're going to pull you to Austin on the springboard. Okay? With the assumption, of course, that for us to prosper in the future, for us to continue doing well in the future, we must have people coming here. And they must be led by entrepreneurs. Now, it's hard for you to envision, but with the medical school going in, and remember, Laura, we did all this on software. In the 1980s, we wrote a proposal for incubator based on the bio stuff for Houston, because we didn't have a medical school. With the medical school, that means that, I don't know, the amount of research might go from, what do we do, 600 million, 700 million, might go to over a billion, 800 million. Okay? So can you imagine what the future would be like? But there are two things that must continue to happen. The best and the brightest, the entrepreneurs, must continue to move to the region. And the Austin model now, all the towns surround us. Because if you ask about Silicon Valley, it's more than just Palo Alto. Because it's so expensive to live there, people start moving to other areas. So you would expect for all of these things to happen. So let's move on to some data. So we got the data, move on, we got the data. And we scraped LinkedIn. We did all this big data stuff. We did a lot of coding. And we came to these kind of conclusions of what's happening. Okay? Now, this is the movement of entrepreneurs, which has never been done before, I might add, from metropolitan areas of origin to metropolitan areas where a company was launched. And this is our LinkedIn sample. Okay? I was telling my research team, you know what, I think I need to get a patent for this. You know, so that I can commercialize it. But let's just look at what's happening and what the data are telling us. Burnt orange is us. Of course, this is from International to San Francisco. The Silicon Valley miracle, 40% of all those companies are newcomers. What cosmetics would call immigrant entrepreneurs. Okay? International to Austin, we're looking at 25. San Francisco to Austin, 14. New York to Austin, 14. Houston, Texas to Austin. From Chicago to Austin. And from Washington, D.C. to Austin. Well, you can see that Silicon Valley is a great, great competitor. Okay? So we look at the next slide. This is the metropolitan areas where entrepreneurs move to launch their startups. This is from 77 to 2014, a sample, and this is from Crunchbase. Okay? Launch. Okay. Now, you begin to think about what George said 40 years ago. Our major competitors are the entrepreneurs of the future. Because literally to keep the region alive, who would ever thought that Apple would come back so strong? What is this Facebook guy? You know, I tell people, you know, Michael was 19, Gates was 24, the guy with Facebook was 14. What the hell is going on here? Huh? Oh, by the way, the thing with Michael is when he dropped out of here, we didn't have a place for him. There was no place for him to go. So we went to IC Square and started PC Limited. There was no academic unit that said, like we have now, and said we're going to build entrepreneurship. Okay? But you can see then, and this of course comes from equations, that San Francisco is formidable. Now what we can do as academicians, and what we're arguing here is that the ecosystem in San Francisco, we'll talk about that in terms of the funding networks of what Rajiv would call the stickiness or the unstickiness of why entrepreneurs would move. So I'm working in regions throughout America. Right now at IC Square are 25 people from Shreveport, Louisiana, whom Glenn West talked to yesterday. And they asked one question: how can we be not like Austin, but how can we develop that same model? But it's very, very difficult, like it is when I go to New Jersey now, or when I go to upstate New York now. Their regions had such great jobs in the past. It's hard for them to envision putting innovation and entrepreneurship at the very, very center. So I went up to Rochester, New York. Bless their heart, they lost Kodak and lost 96,000 jobs because they missed the digital revolution. And when they missed the digital revolution, Kodak disappeared. So Bill Hosey, our IP lawyer here, myself, others, we go there, we're talking about things that will bring people to regions. The things we'll talk about, such as the angel networks, other kind of VC investors. Having the lawyers to understand that you can build a book of business by not charging everybody just money by the hour, but equity to build your company, much like Pike Powers did for us. Okay? So we're getting this data, You say, what's the stickiness? And you begin to look at the funding, what people are trying to do, because remember, the game has changed. The game now in all of these regions is to recruit entrepreneurs. If you look at, this is a total of funding raised by metropolitan areas. Ooh, look at San Francisco. Look at us. Now, this is also, this is us right here. One more time. No, not yet, not yet. So you look at this, you begin to really, really understand how important the network is, how important the ecosystem is. Stop right there, because I'm going to say something now about the wealth creation. And then we get to those slides also. The wealth creation is this. Those who are self-employed own most of the wealth in America. Case closed. And they're stacking up in certain regions. So I want to know why I got to take a number to buy a Lexus in Austin. I want to know why I got to take a number to buy a $1 million home in Austin. Because not only do we have startups that we produce, but people sell their companies, move to Austin, get in the ecosystem, and begin to do what? Begin to invest. So the wealth creation and getting in on the wealth creation is understanding what we'll call the two economies. Two economies. You have the corporate economy, you have the startup economy. This is why it is so important for you to understand what's going on in the laboratory. When I did my company, Glowfish, we have Alan Blake, we have a regular board, and it is a Longhorn company. Chairman of the board is Bill Cunningham, former dean of business school, former chancellor, former president of the university. The IP lawyer, Longhorn. The lawyer was president of the student body. The CEO was a finance major here. You understand two economies. If you don't understand that, because the large economy, it's called the corporate economy, will purchase from the entrepreneur economy. Because what is happening in Austin and Silicon Valley is this. The startup community, when the person from Austin said to me, we need to know where the startups are, and I'm working with Bob Metcalf. The startup communities are really the research kind of efforts for corporate America now. And of course, there's nothing wrong with my students doing a startup, selling it for pick $1 million, and moving on. So we can go back and look at historically the Austin Technology Incubator. And we look at a company called Freescale that came out of the Austin Technology Incubator as MetroWorks. Make sure you weren't sleeping, Laura. As MetroWorks, right? Or we can look at applied science fiction that could have come out at lots of money but had some problems. But here's the deal. All startups for equity, and this is the part of the wealth creation, needs advisors. They need advisors, financial advisors. They need visionaries. They need investors. Can you imagine investing $460,000 in a company and then it being sold for $600 million or $2.4 billion? That is the startup economy in Silicon Valley and Austin, Texas. So we're asking then, bringing people here, we're not going to talk, I'm just going to say this. All of these are Technopolis things. So getting people and moving things here means that what's important in the equation? The more funding rounds, not necessarily the amount of money. The kind of economy that you have now, low unemployment, intermediate size, skilled labor. You can see what we have in Austin. a strong network ecosystem that encourages social tie formation. We like to say in Austin, there's an entrepreneur kind of network event almost every night. Okay? And therefore, when you get the ecosystem together, the wealth creation is off the scale. So what our equations are telling us is that what allows people to remain here are the things that we visualized 35 to 40 years ago. We just have it in equations now. I'm going to brag a little bit more about the University of Texas at Austin and how to get involved in all of this. Laura, we didn't have slides like this 40 years ago. But this is our alumni network, advisor network, common alumni network, advisors, ATI staff, that's the Austin Technology Incubator, and et cetera. Which, by the way, this year has done $100 million for companies that's there. And what this means then is that to become one of these, to get involved with the startup, is to look at the future, and everything is just color-coded. Okay? So now we have the ability to say, look, this is where we are. Let's look at the externals. Next one. This is what we are. This is what we are engaged in. But as a professor, I want to measure it. Okay? So a general proposition to get involved with the wealth creation is the more startups you have, the higher propensity for wealth creation, and the better the outlook for job creation. Now again, let me go back to Milwaukee. I'm working in Milwaukee, working in Rochester, New York. It is difficult for people to understand the model. And I know why it is difficult. So when I'm in Rochester, their tradition was so bound up with the great union tradition of America, which has changed. It was so bound up with great companies. When I say that, when I look at Rochester Institute of Technology, let's take companies out of there. Let's create companies out of there. It's very, very difficult for them to understand. For working in Cleveland, Ohio, because I've come to the general proposition that wherever there was a strong, strong economy in the past, it's very, very difficult to do today. So it was easy for us to do in Texas because we didn't have any great technology companies. Growing up in southern Louisiana, when you said the unions, you meant the student union. Just didn't have unions. Okay? So consequently, conceptualizing and understanding the wealth creation, understanding when I go to Stanford University, when I go out to Stanford, I can't tell the difference between the professors and the entrepreneurs. Because this is a state university. We have to do a little bit different. We have so many rules and regulations about me as a professor being involved with students and creating companies. That's okay, because what? We're still getting it done. So if you want to get in on the, quote, wealth creation of all of these things, then let's talk about some other mechanisms. We like to talk about the idea of what it takes to make these things go. Most of the data you've seen was based on, the statistics are based on venture data, or what we call venture capital data. But we also know that the angel networks and the wealthy individuals are playing an active role. And I can tell you, Austin was built here, for the most part. Okay? It was built here. It was built in both ways. I think Dell was here. I think National Instruments was here, and et cetera. But you can see what's happening here is that if you look at where the money is coming from, and you look at the angel investors, you look at the number of deals which we had there, if you look at the seed capital for angel investors versus VC, well then of course the VCs are allowing the angels to do the due diligence, which is great. Okay? So consequently, the question is, are you a member of an angel investor group? Because here in Texas and around the country, in Texas, around the country, as we see all of these entrepreneurs just flying into Austin here, okay, wonderful. We also know that lots of things are happening in terms of getting in on what we call the basic kind of wealth creation. So what do we have here? What do we have here when we talk about the idea? The idea is, one more, there's so much happening that will allow you to get involved. Well, let's just call it the wealth creation startup kind of tradition. Okay? So in my role as a professor this semester, I had 3 active companies to start. Bill Hoser, the IP lawyer, is involved. I can call him and he said, look, here's the deal. I do them. You know, I look at them. I won't charge the $500 an hour. Okay. Jamie Rose, who's organized all of the wealth in Texas, is involved. Laura Kilcrease, Bob Metcalf, and my good friend, Louise, involved. Because we must provide a place for the students to go. Okay? So getting involved in the wealth creation is understanding this. I walk into my MBA class, I walk into my undergraduate class, and I say, the purpose of this class is to get you into 1% as you go through life. A guy told me, he said, Dr. Butler, this is the only university, well, at IC Square, when I was director of IC Square, that glorifies wealth. Everybody else beat up on it. I said, well, you know what? What we like to say is this. Wealth creation through entrepreneurship is a new economy for the 21st century. Will everybody do it? No. Will everybody understand it? No. Will people try to understand it? Yes. So what has happened here then is that we have an interesting jewel. I would love to turn on the nightly news and get the number of startups by each region. And of course, we can go into the startups in traditional IT, bio, nano, which we haven't done. We'll do that in the data. But can you imagine different kinds of indicators, rather than looking backwards at what we've done? There's not one theory in economics, one theory in sociology, one theory in history that could have predicted the development, let's stay local here, of Microdale, Jim Tressard, evolutionary technologies. You just can't predict it. The only predictive formula that we have is the movement of entrepreneurs. So you begin to think about not only the development of the companies, but all of the providers that's necessary, all of the financial advisors that's necessary, all of the accountants that's necessary, all of the lawyers that's necessary. So therefore, getting in and tapping into it is understanding that other economy. That startup economy that goes from seed to where did these people come from. I took out the slide of Austin over the years that says, so-and-so and so purchased for $40 million. So-and-so and so purchased for $110 million. So-and-so and so purchased for $98 million. So-and-so and so purchased for $5 million. That's the wealth creation. Questions? Oh, by the way, I just thought I'd put up there for the mayor here what the hell we have created here. That's me trying to get home.